Welcome back. Today is a topic that I'm really excited to talk about. It's another gym topic. It's another topic where if you walk into a gym and you're tracking anything and you're counting anything like sets and reps, 3 sets of 10, 5 sets of five, whatever number, you wrote it down and you called it a workout. Here's the problem. The number is one of the noisiest measurements in all training. Two people could be doing the same exact set and rep scheme and it can get completely different outcomes. So one of them adapts and one of them might be spinning their wheels. So today we're going to stop counting reps and start looking at some of the physics again of this subject, because the body responds to numbers not on a whiteboard. It responds to the work being done, the force that is being generated, and the power. So my guest has spent his career in the biomechanics space, in human movement space, and he's back on with me again. And we're going to be taking apart the concept of program design and rebuilding it around variables that actually matter. So today, joining me, if you haven't have heard previous episodes, is Dr. Paul Juris. He's a PhD in biomechanics. He's the former director of the research lab at Cybex International. He's also been a biomechanics consultant for the MBA, the PGA, medical hospital groups. He's been the voice of this of BioInsights, of really keeping us honest to science and less to bro science and mythology is the best way to describe it. So today we're going to take apart concepts of program design itself. Welcome back, Dr. Polgers.
Thank you, Marcelo, as usual. It's always wonderful to be here. So I look forward to these conversations. I really do.
Thank you. So, last time we talked about tissue and motor control, and today I want to zoom in all the way out and really just take a bigger question about program design and how we write training programs. So, in essence, volume is work and intensity is power. So let's start with some hearsay. Why are sets and reps scientifically noisy in the way to measure training volume?
Well, let me answer that by sort of taking a step back first. And I've always said this throughout my career, and I did run a biomechanics research laboratory at Cybex, so we were measuring a lot of stuff. And the fact is that our ability to measure things is strictly dependent on the tools that we have available with which we can make those measurements. Now, that may seem obvious, but when you think about it, when we started this whole journey in strength training and sets and reps and things like that, it began, all the way back in the 70s for the most part. And Arnold was the one who got everybody into the gym and doing this kind of stuff. But back then, the only thing we had to record or measure anything was a pen and paper, right? So we could write down how much weight we did, how many reps we did, and how many times we did that grouping of repetitions. So that's what we had to measure stuff with, and that was our best tool at the time. And the reality is, until we started to get into some of the devices that we are using to track, and they began fairly rudimentary, they're getting more sophisticated now, but we didn't keep up with the change in technology, and so we continued to use sets and reps. And the irony is, a lot of these devices, a lot of the manufacturers of these devices use their technology to measure sets and reps. So wait a minute, I can count that stuff in my head. I don't need a $300 device to tell me how many reps I did. So that's the unfortunate aspect of this, is that some of these tools are still doing the same old thing. Why is it noisy? Because it doesn't take into consideration the quality of those repetitions. It doesn't take into consideration, for example, the range of motion in any one particular repetition, the speed of any repetition, and a lot of other variables that really help us to understand how effectively we're accelerating these weights. And again, I've repeated this ad nauseum. Humans are acceleration machines. What we need to do is to take a mass and accelerate it. And so none of the sets and reps tells us how well we're doing that. And so it's so binary in a way that we lose the nuance in between reps. And so what we end up with is really, it's artificial information that's full of error. And so when we continue to use it, we're not helping ourselves to progress. We're not helping ourselves to monitor, to be cautious when things need to be, to look at bilateral deficits and things like that. It's just too flat, if you will.
So if we take that classic prescription of like 3 sets of 10, if we had to rewrite it in terms of total work instead of reps, how does that change the way a coach can progress that week to week?
So work is interesting because work is force times distance, right? So you need a force transducer in order to help you understand how much force is being created. Force is not the weight. I mean, weight itself is a force because it's being accelerated to the ground. So therefore, we need to overcome that force that's acting against us. So really the question is, how much more force can we generate against the force that's being imposed on us? And if we have a device that allows us to do that, then we can really see how effective we are at different loads. And we can look at, for example, if I have a given load that I've been working with and I'm trying to accelerate it, I can map that rate of acceleration over time. And as it gets greater and greater and greater against the load, it's giving me a much clearer picture of how well I'm moving this object through space, how much stronger I'm getting, how much more power I'm generating. So it really gives us a more refined, detailed look at what I'm doing with these objects that I'm using to build my capacity. And that's what it's really about. In that respect, it's capacity. But then the other side of the coin is tolerance, right? So if I can produce X amount of force against the load, how long can I tolerate generating that force over time? And that's another thing that we can do with the tools that we don't get from sets and rep schemes. Sorry, that's my dog barking in the background.
No worries. So it's kind of interesting because there's a term that you threw in, tolerance, which I kind of define as intensity, and it's isn't it just a percentage of a 1 RM to, let's keep it, 3 sets of 10 typically is prescribed at 70 to 80% of your 1 RM, depending upon what dogma you believe in, right? So what is it really then? Because I think I agree with you. Looking at the workload and looking at how well you moved it either by force or by milliseconds of speed. But then again, not everyone has this, right? So, I know you talked about saying, hey, why are we programming by reps and sets? Why not we program by time, like dosing time, because in essence, everything that we do, all the tasks that we do are really time driven, right? If you really look at it, what's the outcome that you're trying to train for? So I think I'm not trying to complicate or muddy the waters. I'm just trying to say, okay, so if we know, how well you're moving, that means you require a little bit of tech, right? And to look at intensity in that way, is it a percentage of 1 RM or is it what is tolerance and intensity then?
Okay, so it's funny when intensity is an interesting concept in itself, and it has many different definitions, I think. So first of all, here's just a scenario. You take a 20-pound weight and you do a lateral raise, and you do it once. All right. Or you take a 1 pound weight and you do that lateral raise 50 times. Which one was more intense? So, so there's, I think we use intensity. And I know when we work together at
Equinox.
Equinox. Yeah, so we were defining intensity by how much load you're working with, how many sets you're doing, and how many reps you're doing. And so in that respect, what you're talking about is volume, right? What is the volume of work with the load that you're doing?
Hmm.
There's a concept called supraphysiological overload. And what supraphysiological overload means is that any combination of load and time, and repetitions in a way is representative of time. The more reps you're doing, the longer you're doing this particular activity, right? So there's any combination of load and time can create a physiological intensity or loading. And so you can have a very lightweight done over a very long period of time. You could have a very heavyweight done over a very short period of time. And essentially, it's the same intensity, which is almost perceived exertion, is how much effort is being put into this thing in order to manage what you're doing. So what I like to do is kind of take it from that perspective. It's not that this is a volume issue, right? This is load, time, expression. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And we can monitor that with devices. And in that respect, I think it's good to do that because it gives us an understanding of, okay, I'm able to produce force like this, but how long can I sustain it? And what happens after a while I'm doing it?
Is it better to do it continuously or episodically? Because I know people that, like, that are just so obsessed with collecting so many data points that it's paralysis by analysis sometimes. So I look at this, a coach that's listening that doesn't have force plates and high end sensors. A simple way to approximate work and power in a weight room is the way that we kind of did it at Equinox. We looked at the load itself and the reps and then calculated that total volume compared to the percentage maximum, right? And then as they progressed in a either a conjugated method or a linear method, we showed that outcome, right? Along with
Mm-hmm.
body fat changes or body mass changes as well, and
Mm-hmm.
looking at other aspects of their life, right? Other subjective things. So, what are some? I guess I just kind of answered myself, right? Those were the low.
You did.
That's kind of the low end, But I guess engineering these load types. Um, what we made the case in the previous episode 4, who was listening. We talked about tension, we talked about longitudinal hypertrophy, and then tendon stiffness. And in your words, I think you talked about eccentric loading as kind of like not necessarily a vaccine, but like preventative solutions for injury. What actually happens, I guess, at that tissue level, because if we look at reps and set schemes, right? We look at phases traditionally that are programmed, and I think I think what's more meaningful at this like concept of eccentrics is, I think what people have always waited for is, well, you can't do eccentric loading because you're not strong enough. But I think that's, again, a misnomer, right? Everyone's trying to identify when you can do these variables. If we had to compare, is it better to just have people vary loads, vary intensities for a beginner? Does it really matter? Or should we be doing the traditional approach?
I think when we take someone who hasn't been in the gym before and introduce them to weight training, the first thing that we need to do is create compliance. We need to create some comfort. People need to feel confident that in what they're doing and not be intimidated by what they're experiencing. So for any newcomer into the gym, we want to start really easy. Just the key initially is consistency. Can we get them in the gym consistently? And we're not talking about athletes yet. We're
Yeah.
just talking about everyday people walking into the gym. And that's who most people are going to be working with. So for me, at least for the first 30 days, we're really not varying much of anything. We're actually even doing a lot of repetition on the exercises that they're doing, as opposed to, the insanity concept of never doing the same thing twice, which is to me insane by its very nature. But yeah,
Kind of like a
so
structural tolerance kind of phase.
it's emotional adaptation, it's psychological confidence building. Yes, and it's getting the body to now understand what the game is with these devices and tools and how to move it. And so, at least for the first 4 weeks, maybe even 6 weeks, I don't see any reason to start introducing any kind of modification scheme. So I'll call that a big block. It's just block training. Okay. Now, once you've established that and you want to start working on strength acquisition, that's when we want to start getting into sort of a wave loading, variable loading model. Where does that come from? It comes from a guy named Richard Berger. Richard Berger was a professor at Temple University, and I think he may have moved to one other university at some point. He started all this research in the 60s. And again, this is all founded for the most part on weight, sets, and reps. This is where all this stuff comes from. And what he detected, and it still works today, it's just not working as well as we could with the devices we have available. But what he determined was if you always trained at the same intensity, even if it's maximum intensity, if you always train at 90% of your 1RM, you're going to stop seeing gains in a fairly brief period of time because the system accommodates to that and the stimulus for change is no longer there. And what he found was that when you varied the load from workout to workout, when you went light one day and kind of heavy one day, and then maybe some moderate level work on another day, so that's a wave load, you actually get better strength gains over time. And they're also maintained longer after detraining. So if you took 2 weeks off, you're not going to lose your strength as quickly. And I found that to be really interesting. And so most of the programs that I developed introduced that wave scheme, roughly at the 6 to 8 week mark in somebody's training program. So if you look at their cycles, it's more of a mesocycle type thing. But it actually works really well. So I find, once you get someone there, it makes sense to do that. In order to do that effectively, you need to test their strength on a regular basis so that you can adjust the weights accordingly. And you need to be measuring stuff. You need to be constantly monitoring where they are, how they're doing. And I watch trainers in the gym and they never record anything. Most of the time it's just showing someone how to do a movement, demonstrating, which drives me nuts, and just showing people what to do and watching them do it and then moving on to the next thing. It's like, wash, rinse, and repeat.
That's the challenge. And that's really what's kind of been the problem in the industry, right? Because adoption of personal training varies between group to group, and then, if someone's listening here, what's a simple decision tree that you can do that looks like, X, you give them this type of workload, Y, you give them this type of workload? Because I think that would kind of piece this together because, to kind of summarize what we just stated, which was, you kind of your initiation with that client is to do, or to, if you're an athlete and you're thinking about applying this, you're picking basic movements and you're building repetitions, because you're building structural, it's a structural phase. So you're looking at tendon, you're looking at ligament health, you're looking at concept of hypertrophy, of adding muscle. So you don't necessarily need to lift heavy. You should at least identify what you can do as a repetition maximum. I recommend 3 to 5 rep maximum sometimes, as opposed to trying to go to 1 RM, because of the risk of doing a 1 RM test, especially if you're doing this on your own. A 10 RM, I think we've discussed this in a previous episode, the margin of error goes up, because fitness changes day to day, guys. That's why you want to have a simple decision tree that we're just going to talk about here. What are some ways, like I get them to week 6, week 8, and I'm going to do, let's say, and I want to do a wave load, and I've identified what they can do for a potential 1 RM using a 3 RM maximum, and I get them to their first wave, and I notice that instead of being able to do 3 to 5 reps like I prescribed, they're only doing 1 or 2. So what do I do there? Do I stop? Do I, what's that decision tree? What does it look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. The first thing you have to ask is, how are they doing today? Right? So the prescription for that day may be fine, but your client may not be fine that day. So the first thing you need to do is stop and say, hey, how you doing today? All right, so tell me what's going on, because we've had this model, we've been tracking these loads, and rep schemes are based on everything we've been doing to this point. Like, are you tired? Did you not sleep last night? Like, what's going on with you? So that's the first question. And then if they say, oh no, I'm great, then the next question is, well, where did I mess up in creating this loading scheme? Because obviously this is not the right one for the moment. So that's a place to start. The other thing I would say about wave loading, and there's lots of ways of introducing variability, by the way, and it doesn't mean that we necessarily have to constantly change things, like on a wild basis, like change everything that you're doing. So if you're doing, let's say, a heavy, medium, and light model on a week-to-week basis, let's say you're going to do this for 6 weeks. You don't go heavy, medium, and light every single week. You flip the sequence of that, right? So what we want to do is, let's say, a heavy, medium, and light, and then a medium, light, heavy, and then a heavy, light, medium. And then so you're not only doing waves, but what you're also doing is changing up that sequence. And that's really important, because what will happen, again, the nervous system accommodates. And so if it's constantly getting the same sequence, it's just going to get used to the sequence. In order to force adaptation within the system, you need to change the sequence so that all of a sudden there's something different. There's a different stimulus there, and the brain has to solve what that is, and then you can proceed from there. So it's important that we model these things the right way so that we can get good outcomes. And, it's funny, I even did that in the NBA with practice. So when I was working with the Mavericks, the team always used to follow the exact same training sequence. They would come in, they would do some stretching, they would run the floor and do some floor work. They would break out into offense and defensive sets. Then they finish up with free throw shooting and shooting games. They were always shooting for money, by the way. These guys, like, in order to get them to shoot, you got to pay them at the end. It's crazy, actually. But but I said to the coach, I said, this is great, but have you ever thought of changing this sequence up? Like, get them warmed up, and why don't you break out and right away into like offense defense sets and worry about the shooting later? And why don't you fatigue the hell out of them and then have them do their free throw shooting rather than, just sitting around and shooting? And so they started to implement that. And It's the same concept applied to strength training.
Yeah.
We're not changing the exercises, we're just changing the way we go at them.
Yeah, no, I've encountered that with a couple of NCAA programs where they would put their athletes under fatigue and then have them try to do the skill because that's exactly what's going to happen in the game sometimes. And
Mm-hmm.
the coaches were like, well, I don't want that. I want to work on technique. Well, here's the facts. They're going to have to vary those intensities because, to your point, those are constraints that are design choices. They're not a limitation. So, but there's a reason why you want to have a novice or someone that's rehabbing minimize those constraints, right? So before they earn that challenge, before maybe you decide to make it more complex. That's kind of brings exercise choice into question.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, when does a person earn that? When does a person earn a leg extension before a walking lunge? What would be a simple checklist that you would give someone to say, okay, you've actually earned more degrees of freedom in that movement pattern?
So there's a way to deconstruct human movement to understand relative task complexity. And I think from a programmatic perspective, it's always best to start with lower complexity level activities and then gradually work the way up. So for lower body exercises, for example, one question we can ask is the goal of this activity to just be stable, or is the goal of this activity to be mobile? Mobile activities are more dynamic than stable activities. Even though I'm moving, the overall objective may be not to move my body through space. So, for example, a standing cable hip abduction. We're moving one limb, but the overall objective for the body is to remain stable in place versus doing lateral lunges where I'm still working my hip abductors, but the objective is to dynamically displace my body through space. Those require two different levels of cognition and motor control, right? So there's a different level of complexity associated with that. So if we deconstruct exercises just based on those two factors, for lower body, is
Mm-hmm.
the goal stability or mobility? Mobility doesn't necessarily mean range of motion around the joints. It means displacing my center of mass through space. What is the objective there? And if I start with stability oriented goals and exercises, I can work from that and then start getting more and more and more mobile and dynamic over time. Now, more dynamic means adding more inertia to the activity. So I can do a lateral lunge. That's a quote dynamic exercise. But if I do it really slowly and in a controlled way, the relative level of dynamism is low versus I'm going to leap laterally and land on one leg, which is what constitutes a leap, and then stick it. That's a very, very high dynamic activity, which is not something that I would introduce to someone unless I knew that they had really good eccentric control, that they had really good power available to them, that they had really good equilibrium control. I wouldn't do that until we reach that point. And so you have to work your way up to that.
I think that's a really gold nugget there. If you look at how exercise selection should be based on obviously training history, but then you own and earn movements as you progress.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of leads us to the conversation that we've had in the past about unilateral loading
Mm-hmm.
and how the benefits of unilateral loading, as far as muscle activation at far less loads on the spine, you know, and the benefits of that. It has nothing really to do necessarily with the individual as far as the selection of exercise, I think it's more about, like you defined it, there's a mobility requirement and there's a stability requirement. So what does that mean to a person, an athlete over, let's say 50? We've talked about this before as well. Selection of exercise like this, why is it important to do more unilateral training? And I think you've already indicated that the term bilateral deficit before. I think that
Mhm.
kind of addresses this.
Well, a lot of movements that we do in it, look, if all you do is get up, walk around, and lie down, then we don't have to worry too much about that stuff, right? But if you're running or if you're playing a game, even pickleball, um, tennis being a more dynamic version of that, or if you like basketball, whatever it is you want to do, then what happens is we end up with differential dynamic loading on each limb. And it's very rarely are we using both limbs simultaneously. I mean, when we're jumping, we are obviously, but there's always a difference in the force output side to side. When even I'm a skier, and you think when both skis are on the ground, we're applying force equally, but we're not. We apply force more to the inside ski versus the outside ski during different turns. So it really benefits us to train ourselves unilaterally so that each leg is capable of handling the variable stresses that are imposed on it, as opposed to dividing it between both limbs. Squats are great, don't get me wrong. I mean, deadlifts are great. I'm not denouncing those. I'm simply saying that we need to introduce unilateral training as part of the overall package, and not get too hung up on these bilateral exercises, which are, it's funny that, I'll call them a boutique exercise. I mean, we've been doing them forever. But if you go in the gym and watch what people are doing, I mean, the things that I see most commonly done are some form of squat and some form of glute bridge. Like the exercise du jour is laying on your back on, the thoracic spine of your back on a bench, having a bar across your hips and doing glute bridges. I mean,
Yeah.
I see this stuff all day long.
Yeah.
And I know why people do it. I get it. But, if you're thinking about functional outcomes and meaningful performance outcomes, that'll work for sure, but it's not necessarily going to allow someone to perform under highly variable conditions, especially as the cognitive component starts to increase. And that's the part that you mentioned. We, when we're overloaded cognitively, all hell breaks loose. And that is really the issue, is what is the cognitive load here? And we can start thinking about, all right, how do we attack that too? Because that's part of the equation.
Yeah. I mean, the commercial facilities still are built around barbells and these bilateral patterns. Um,
Smith machines and yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So how can we reconcile the reality of everything, and just improve, lateral loading? Is that a part? I think. I mean, I look at it as equipment companies need to do a better job, as well as the coach needs to reconcile this into their programming. So is the operator. I think being more mindful in having these checks and doing an audit, and making sure that the workflow is appropriate, so people can understand, because otherwise it's how it's sold and it's how it's built on a floor. It's like, all right, you're going to go through this whole row of equipment, and we're not that fails to kind of create the outcome, a meaningful outcome, right? Because otherwise all we're doing is to your point, if they're sitting down and lying down for the majority of the time, and all we're doing is adding more bilateral deficit. That's not really going to help them.
No, it's true. When when the system has a stronger side, the brain will always favor the stronger side. And it's just the way it works. I mean, and there's a good reason for that. Look, my friend Scott Moody talks about this all the time. when you have a side which is really dominant and it's like it helps you perform at a very high level, why would you ignore it? I mean, that's what's helping you to perform at a very high level. So we don't want to ignore that, right? But getting back to the equipment and things that are in the gym, what's interesting is, so I work at a big box, very well-known big box gym, but we don't need to mention names, but they have a whole circuit of selectorized equipment, which is, it's decent equipment. And they also have plate loaded. So this is where we can get into how do we do better with the kind of training that we're doing. So they have plate loaded devices. Now, plate loaded is really interesting because what you're doing is you're putting plates on either side, and each side works independently of the other. They're not linked, right? So a plate loaded bench press, you have an arm on one side and an arm on the other side. You put the plates on, each side moves independently of the other side. So think about what that affords us. There are different types of movement patterns that we can create for any one exercise. Bilateral means both arms are moving in the same direction at the same time. Unilateral, only one arm is moving at a time. Alternating, you move one arm and then you move the other arm. Reciprocal, you move both arms in opposite directions at the same time. Those are all different patterns of movement that have different levels of cognitive load, by the way. So I watch people get on these plate-loaded machines. How do you think they do it? It's always bilateral. I never see anybody doing unilateral movements on those machines. Yeah. I never see anybody doing alternating movements or reciprocal movements. When I get on those machines, I reciprocate. Right? So I can do unilateral. And when you do unilateral, by the way, then you're starting to work your oblique muscles. You're getting, different crossing effects in your core. And so I don't see anybody doing that. So why not? Because they don't know any better. They don't know any better because YouTube videos don't necessarily show that if they're looking for YouTube videos anyway. And the people on the floor who are instructing aren't giving them that information to help them to understand how they could take advantage of this. So there's an education problem, there's a training problem, there's an awareness problem, and it's because, human movement science is absent from this whole process.
Yeah, it comes back to education, and I think you could improve business outcomes even from a service side as well as a reoccurring membership side if you actually promote this in a meaningful way to the community. And I think it's pretty easy to do. I've seen facilities put QRS codes. I've seen facilities try to host monthly events or topics to their members or to their trainers. For years we've kind of talked about this. I think the biggest thing that we can talk about is kind of auditing your not only the workflow, but these concepts of loading and provide a community a better opportunity to be healthier, to be more fit, but also can bring people together. I think, getting back to a topic that we kind of talked about before, you talked about, movement, capturing, monitoring, how far they moved, right? Mm-hmm. You've argued you care less about how far they moved and how they started that intensity exposure in time. Does it capture, what does time capture that cumulative distance misses?
Well, I'm not sure that I would say I don't care about how far they moved. I think, just to put that in context, every movement has a goal. Right? We start off with what is the goal of the movement. The goal of the movement is not to make a muscle twitch. Right? That's the mechanism that makes you move. The goal of the movement is to move a limb to a point in space, or to move our body to a point in space. That's the goal of the movement. Now, some movement goals would require full range of motion. Some movement goals may require only a very brief range of motion, and the goal is not to create a big range of motion, but to limit the range of motion under a controlled state. So what I mean, so when I'm saying I'm less concerned about how far we move, it's, if someone's doing a full range of motion and someone says you always have to do a full range of motion, then I'm saying stop. Always is a bad term right there. Are they doing the appropriate range of motion for the goal of the movement in order to achieve that in particular? And that's where I get into how far people move. But when we're talking about amalgamating a bunch of repetitions with a certain weight, now I'm interested in how much work did you do? And now we get into force times distance. So let's say I have a very short range of motion and I want to do a fixed amount of work and make that amount of work the same as it would be if I had a big range of motion. What I need to do is adjust the weight so that the force that I'm producing varies through that range of motion. And I can get the same work output. And that's where work becomes a really valuable tool for me, because it doesn't confine me, it doesn't restrict me to weight sets and reps. I can do a whole variety of different combinations and still have a work output, and then say, okay, did I do all the work that I wanted to do? And that really is, for me, it's a much better way of doing it. And then I model it even further than that, right? Then I'm looking at area under the curve. I look at power. I look just at acceleration rates. I can deconstruct that in a variety of ways to look at different aspects, but it starts there.
And I think, this is taking that concept of wave loading and now adding the hidden space, the hidden data, right? Which is peak power, eccentric velocity, concentric velocity, looking at the action. I think, I think what people need to also understand is, why does high magnitude stress need so many fewer exposures to cause tissue damage than lower intensity work? Because you mentioned it, you can work out long and lower intensity, or you work at higher intensities at shorter bouts. So why do you need to do less of high, and why does the body, what's that stress life relationship?
Okay, again, this comes down to trying to accelerate a mass. And when you have very heavy load and the brain is now recognizing that, what it's going to do is going to recruit motor units so that you can overcome that load. And if it gets a lot of fast twitch activity going, then you're going to get a very rapid onset of muscle twitching against a very heavy resistance. And that leads potentially to strain in the connective tissues, particularly the tendons, right? So you get a lot of tendinous strain as a result of that. If you continuously expose the body to that kind of stuff, it just wears it out, and then ultimately it fails. Ultimately, that stress does become strain, and that strain is damage. So constant exposure to that is really counterproductive and overall detrimental. So there are, again, different ways of creating intensity, and getting people to be able to sustain a lighter activity over a longer period of time is also very useful. It conditions the tissues to be able to continuously work against that, right? So if you're a runner, like, do you end up with plantar fasciitis or Achilles tendonitis or patellofemoral pain syndrome? That's a repetition kind of thing. It's a super physiological overload of tissues where stress becomes strain. If we can condition ourselves to work through those things and not hurt ourselves and progress that over time, then the long-term benefit is going to be there.
And that's where I think someone needs to translate that relationship and actually make the decision of, what does the weekly schedule look like and recovery look like? Because I
Yeah.
think that's what people treat their body like currency. That's where the sets and rep schemes, like, I have to do Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Well, do you? If you're still sore on Wednesday, could you push that to Thursday? That's not the end of the world. You're not breaking any rules. What's an optimal amount of recovery? What's that window optimally? I mean, I've seen research say anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. That's where
Mm-hmm.
it's a sweet spot. And as you age, I got news for you guys. You sometimes need to do the 72 hours, especially if you decide to do wave loading or you try to do a meathead workout of 5 sets of five. Though, because again, Dr. Juris really just mentioned it. It could lead to tendon issues or ligament issues, and I think that's where I think, so far what we've talked about is turning this theory into kind of a weekly calendar. And if we look at reps and sets schemes, we're not saying not to do 3 sets of 10 or 3 sets of 15 or 3 sets of 20. I think you got to ask yourself that question is based on your goal, what do you need? And on your first phase, you should be looking at that structural load because you want to build up the armor on your body. So when you actually then introduce these higher intensity loads or these more complex, less stable activities because you're trying to challenge yourself neurologically, because everything comes back to your central nervous system, folks. You got to
Absolutely.
drive. You got to drive it. So, of an operator's listening right now, what's the one metric that they should stop chasing, and what should it be replaced on, let's say, a Monday morning for you?
Well, I think, look, with all of this conversation, as you just said, weight sets and reps are still useful. I'm
Yes.
not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? We can still use them as general guides to how we're doing. The one measure that sort of emerged recently that I looked at it, fairly carefully and really tried to understand it was RER. And um, so repetition, RIR, repetitions in reserve, right? So that became sort of in vogue, right? Let's look at
Yeah.
repetitions in reserve. So what does it mean? Is you're doing a series of repetitions and you're trying to figure out how strong you are. The question isn't like how much weight can you do 10 times, is when you're given a weight and you're doing repetitions, what do you think is what is left in the tank after a certain amount of repetitions? So if you've done 10, how many more can you do before you quit? And so that is being used now, even by device manufacturers, as a new gold standard. Repetitions in reserve. What have you got left? And I thought about it and I said, well, isn't that just another RPE?
Yeah.
Honestly, so aren't we just saying, well, I've done all these reps, so what's my perceived effort and what do I think I can do? Well, what I think I can do is irrelevant. The question is, what actually can I do? And the problem is, as you said earlier in this conversation, you don't want to go to 1RM because that's too risky.
Yeah.
The other factor is the research shows that when you're doing that reps in reserve model, the fewer reps you ultimately do, the farther away you are from your maximum output, the less accurate the measure is. So it's just another subjective way of trying to figure out what your max is. And to me, it's not going to give you any more value than doing a 10 RM test. So that's the one that I'm like, this is very suspect to me, and I don't think people should. I mean, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying think about what you're doing before you just jump into the pool.
Yeah, they kind of add a little bit of color to that. In the program design days, typically a daily dose, anywhere from 32 to 30 to 24 sets in a day, has kind of been the window of training that we've programmed with. How much load do you add on to a large muscle, to a small muscle? And, if you're looking at this, you know, there's different, I would say, ways of looking at this, depending upon what training application you're applying. There's German volume training, there's conjugated training, there's linear. And people say, well, I want to do for chest, I don't want to do more than 32 sets in a week. So how does that spread over? But again, it goes back to this is super subjective, or should we be, focusing on that Monday? This week, I'm going to make sure that one, I'm monitoring, my fatigue level, that I'm getting good sleep, and that when I'm getting my workouts, the work I'm doing at the intensity I'm doing are at the best intent that I'm focusing in on. So if I had to create a one-page, dashboard for an operator that blends this performance and, let's say, business health, what does that look like to the operator?
It's a really good question. This is the way I look at it. When people have become one of the known facts is that as people get stronger, as they get more fit, as their athleticism improves, so on and so forth, the magnitude of change at any given time gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So as people are getting stronger, healthier, more fit, blah, 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 you're seeing smaller changes as a result of their training. So what happens is the level of detail at which we're approaching these people, the nuance in the way we attack certain aspects of their training, that becomes really critical. We have to be very deliberate. We have to be precise. We have to target very specific aspects of what they're doing in order to make incremental changes over time. Those are very, very, very difficult to achieve, by the way. So as we as practitioners are working with a high performance person, we have to be really, really good at this in order to get them to change anything at all. At the opposite end of the spectrum, when you have someone's coming in for the first time, they make enormous changes in the first 2 weeks, right?
Yeah.
They can have as much as a 40% improvement in strength in 2 weeks, and that's all neural.
Yep.
So the way I would approach those people is anything they do is fine. So I don't care really, just so long as they do something. I don't have to get so hung up in these minutiae, these tiny little details. Just get them in, get them doing something, anything, and then get them into a healthy habit. Once they're there, then you could start to pay attention to some of these loading schemes and different types of contraction types and different movement patterns. But early on, just doing anything is okay. So those are two opposite ends of the spectrum. And it depends where we want to live as practitioners. If we really want to work with high performance individuals, we better understand motor control, biomechanics, physiology, psychology. We need to understand all of this stuff. Human movement science. We need to understand environmental constraints. Most people don't even know what those words mean. So that's a challenge.
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. I've had a lot of, I've spoken and I've seen a lot of different types of programs that have implemented great workouts, right? That either creates that behavior modification initially for that individual, but then it eventually reaches the law of diminished returns, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't see results anymore. So why does this all matter? And what we just presented to everyone here is because anyone that's running a facility, you program basically around work and about intensity, power, whatever metric, instead of an arbitrary rep target. You're trying to train smarter because you're trying to spare tissue. You're trying to keep clients healthier, hopefully everyone. And it pays for their membership longer. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a business out of this, but at the same time, we're trying to improve the health of that individual. So it's not, it's not at all a wellness argument. This is also a business argument. So, you came, Paul, you've always really, talk about this in the concepts of the science and the outcomes to that individual. So, I really appreciate that. Again, you're straightforward and you really help trainers and owners and operators understand this. So if there's any references today, I'll put them in the show notes. I really want to thank you for another great topic of discussion. Program design is something that I feel like people need to take the time to understand. And it kind of, for a beginner, there's no really wrong way of doing this. The thing is, you got to be able to do it consistently and with discipline. After that, if you want to improve, then you need a professional that's going to be able to measure these workloads and training loads and program loads that can guide you to those outcomes. Please select an accredited, certified individual that knows what they're talking about, and not because they have a great six-pack and great personality. I've seen it for 25 years, and it's kind of crazy that we've seen this and we're still talking about the same things.
Indeed.
So thanks again, and can't wait for our next conversation. Have a great July 4th if I don't get to talk to you, and I hope everyone stays happy and healthy out there.
Thanks, Marcelo. Happy to be here as usual.